Oh yeah, I love watching her play though. It's great. Okay, so I started recording and I'm in the middle of a sentence. Sorry, Maddie. Um, so Matty Dalrymple is with me. Did I pronounce your last name the right way?
You did.
Okay, great. Very self-conscious about that, so I'm glad. And you are author extraordinaire, mystery novels, which are fantastic. This is actually your second time on the podcast. And
Yes.
I think you are the second person who has made a dual appearance. The only other one is Sherry Decker Hurst. So you've been on twice, which is awesome.
Cool.
Yeah. So big honor, or I'm sorry, I'm not sure which way to take that.
A big honor.
Oh,
I'm going to go with the honor.
thanks. Yeah. And so we're going to talk about one of your mystery novels, but you are also the host of a podcast I absolutely love called the Indy Author Podcast. You do phenomenal interviews on there.
And you were one of them.
I was one of them, which was fun back in like October, which is
Yeah, it was a
crazy.
while ago now. Yeah.
Oh, it's so nuts. But yeah, I really liked your most recent. Well, this won't come out for like 3 weeks, but when we did it, it was your most recent. When we're recording, it was one of your most recents where you did a compilation of authors talking about brand, which was
Yeah,
just
that was super fun.
fantastic. Yeah, I
That
love
was
that.
one of my favorite ones, I think.
You wouldn't know the episode number off the top of your head, do you?
I
I'm
think
gonna be
it's
super impressed.
74.
Oh,
But if they go to the indieauthor.com/podcast and just look for personal branding, they'll be able to find the link to the episode.
awesome. That's perfect. Yeah. So go check out episode 74. It was amazing. Um, and there were so many people on there that I was like, I need to pay attention to these people because I don't know all their podcasts, but they were all podcasters. I was like, I'm gonna load up my phone now. Uh,
Yeah, I was very lucky in the people who chose to respond to that one. And hopefully, there are going to be more of those perspectives on ones. So, and I know you
oh,
know that because
that's
you've
fun.
already submitted an entry for the next one.
Yeah. Well, you asked about writer's block, and I was man, that is my nemesis. So
Yeah, I'm going to be very interested to see what people have to say about that.
yeah, yeah, that is my nemesis. I am writer's block, and I don't get along. Uh, he's always lurking around,
Yeah.
tempting me to go watch Schitt's Creek. That's my newest. That's my current guilty pleasure. Is when writer's block hits real hard. It's like you don't want to write tonight. You want to watch Schitt's Creek, and I'm like,
There's always
I
something.
do. Yeah, there's always something with
There's always
Netflix. There's
something.
always something
Yeah.
on. Okay, we're looking at a piece today, and this is book 2 in your mystery series. Um, what the mystery series? Do you remember what's the title of it again?
So it's the Anne Kinnear suspense novels.
That's it.
And interestingly, so they're 4 books. The one I sent you the excerpt from is from book 4, which is out at the end of this month, which is April
Nice.
2021.
Awesome.
And the third and the fourth are definitely mysteries. The first and the second are more suspense in the sense
Okay.
that, especially in the first one, you know right away who done it, and
Yeah.
the action is driven by whether the bad guy and the protagonist are going to cross paths and how that's going to turn out. But 3 and 4 are definitely mysteries. So
Nice.
I have this weird like genre shift thing going on.
Nah, that's good. They're cousins. Mysteries
I
and
think so.
suspense are
I think
cousins.
so.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, and I really love. I read a bunch of your Anne stuff earlier in the year, and I really like it. You do a really great
Well,
job
thank
with
you.
it. It's a great series. And I'm going to apologize to the listeners. Maddie, you know this because we were talking about it a second ago. I literally walked in from my daughter's soccer game, sat down and hit record, and so I'm a little scattered today. So just
We'll power through it.
yeah, a little scattered, a little emotional. She got to play soccer even though COVID was happening, and this was the last. They had a shortened month and a half season, and this was the last game of her season. So it was,
So you
and they
can't
won,
miss that.
which was nice. Yeah, I couldn't miss it. I had to be there. Okay, so let's talk about the piece. And first, I want to talk about what I loved about what you're doing because you're doing something, and I'm going to share my screen so they can see it. And
Okay.
I also share my screen to hide my face. That's a little secret between you and me, Maddie. Nobody else will hear that. So, a couple things that I really love that you're doing here that I think all authors could learn something from, myself included, is so this is a setup chapter. That's what I would call it.
Yes.
You're kind of introducing some characters, you're like building background, you're covering stuff that happened in previous books.
Yeah.
And you're kind of setting the scene for the mystery. You're dropping characters in and kind of like setting the table for dinner
Yep.
necessarily. And you do the whole thing. I'm just going to scroll here for a minute. The whole 13 pages is dialogue centric, which is beautiful. When you sent this to me, I was so happy.
I picked it on purpose because I was like, dialogue doctor.
Yeah, it's great. So let me ask you, I know I do this and I know others do this. Was the amount of dialogue in this intentional?
Yes, it was, because there isn't a lot going on action wise. And so I wanted there to be some kind of engaging thing going on, and dialogue seemed like a good option.
Yeah, it was great. Did you do anything special to get that to make it a dialogue centric piece?
I just pictured the scene playing out, and one of the things that was challenging about it is that I could have, the way the scene originally played out in my mind, it probably would have been half as number of pages, but I had to, because this is the setup chapter and because it's book 4 of a series, I had to figure out a way to insert some backstory for the people who either hadn't read, an Anne book for a long time. Actually, it wouldn't have been that long. The last one came out in October, but nonetheless, maybe they read 1 and now they're skipping to 4 and they don't remember.
You never know.
Or
or
they're starting at 4. So that was tricky. I wanted to do that using dialogue, but I didn't want it to sound like, so said Anne to her brother who worked at the post office down the street,
Yeah. And so one of the things I want to talk to you about is building energy in your dialogue, which is like, and let me just be clear, your dialogue's so good, right? Like the back and forth is great. It feels realistic. You get a very authentic feel from it, right? Like, so it's so great. We're going to talk about like some 201 level crap, like, getting like more advanced than what we're talking about.
Cool.
Yeah. And I may get a little like, fancy dancy on you, or woo woo is the word I've heard other people use, because just taking it to the next level, I think, but you're nailing it. It's good. I know when I do these kind of chapters, I have to write one of these tonight for my work in progress, and it is 100% a transition chapter. Like in my head, it's like, okay, I need to get some plot points across. I need the characters to like have a moment of reflection where they're like thinking about what they're going to do next. And those chapters can be so boring. So what I do when I have to write chapters like that, or when I have to info dump, is I write a dialogue only first draft, where I don't write, if I can avoid writing names, I avoid writing names. I just put the letter of each person's name, and then I just write the sentence that, like, I just write the back and forth between the characters. And then I'll put in like parentheses, like leaves room, goes to next room, and then I'll like go pick back up with the conversation, because doing that forces me to keep it all in the dialogue. But that's a trick I use.
Yep, I like that a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about, is there anything specific you want to talk about before I jump in? I have 5 things. I want to talk about 1 sentence intros to characters. I want to talk about building the energy in the piece, especially when you're talking about like mundane scene setting things. Some ways that you're building the energy really, really well, and then some ways I want you to like just make a couple little tweaks that'll like increase the pace of things. I want to talk about exaggerating personalities, which kind of also goes into building energy. And I want to talk about the cadence at the end of your first scene, and like how we can bring a nice cadence there that gives the reader a nice sense of like resolution without letting the reader close the book, right? Like, because that's like, we want them to feel resolved, but we don't want them to be like, I can stop now, right? Like, so giving that like artificial resolution.
I think that's great, because I recognize that that's something that I do like to close out a chapter, but sometimes I close it out a little more than than I should.
Yeah, and there's that weird balance between like closing it too quickly, which I would say the end of the first scene in your piece closes a little too quickly, right? Like I was like, oh, it felt a little jerky, right? Like you're in a car where like they don't know how to use the clutch. Does anybody use a clutch anymore? You're in a car, you're in a
No.
really old car
Yeah.
and you don't know how to use the clutch. And so the car is like jerky as you're taking off. That's kind of how the first scene transition felt. And so I think we can talk a little bit about like emotionally wrapping that'll help make that transition smoother, but keeping the content um, tight and keeping the content where like they want to keep reading. So we'll get into that in a second. Besides those four things, was there anything else you wanted to talk about before we jump into the
I
piece?
think the only other thing is something that we touched on a little bit when I was on your podcast before, but we weren't talking about it. We were kind of talking about it out of context, but that is the idea of dialogue attributions and factoring in the audiobook experience and even the
Yeah.
audiobook narrator, because my first through third Anne Kinnear books were narrated by a woman who is much more of a reader. And the
Okay.
fourth one is going to be narrated by someone who's much more of a performer.
Okay.
And I probably took out more dialogue attributions in this one because I knew the person, because I thought that reading it on the page, it would be clear. And I thought that the person who was going to be narrating it would sufficiently differentiate the dialogue that I didn't need the attributions. But then let's say that narrator fell through and I had to get another narrator. Would I then have to go back and re-add all the dialogue attributions? So that's just something I struggle with every time.
Interesting. Yeah. And I remember when we had that conversation, I hadn't had a good experience yet. And I have now since had a good experience with the narrator. And because there's a Spectrum audiobooks grabbed my three mysteries and asked to do the audiobook version of them. And the
Oh, cool.
narrator they found is amazing. So, but listening to her, I actually learned a lot about that. So I feel like I know a little bit more about it. I can actually speak from experience rather than just from gut. I do listen to a massive amount of audiobooks. I always have an audiobook going because I get them from. I don't know if people know about this, but there's this Overdrive is a app you can use that allows you to check out audiobooks from the library, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I get all I like to read. I have an obsession with listening to Pulitzer Prize winning books. So I'm like working my way through every Pulitzer Prize winning book
That's
over
very
the
cool.
last 30 years. So yeah, it's great. And they're all, because it's a library subscription, they're all in there. You just sometimes you got to wait for them.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a super weird aside, but if you're looking for a great audiobook to listen to, Matthew McConaughey got a memoir called Green Lights, and he
Green
reads it.
lights?
Green Lights, and it's so funny because I'm laughing because he just like anytime he gets an opportunity, he like capitalizes on it. That's kind of the theme of the memoirs. Like if you get a chance, you got to run to it, and so he keeps saying it is like Matthew McConaughey, very chill style. At the end of chapters, he'll just go green lights. But yeah, it's great. If you're looking for a fun audiobook to listen to, it's read by him, and so it's just really it is 8 hours of Matthew McConaughey being his full 100% persona. It's amazing. Okay, so let's talk about. I'm going to tie that dialogue attribution, or I tend to call them dialogue tags, into this idea of keeping the energy of your piece going. So the problem with dialogue only chapters that are doing work, right, that are like bringing in this like setting or bringing in this like past information, is that they can get mundane. Because like you're saying, there's not a lot of action happening, especially for thriller and suspense readers. It can feel like a little bit of a trudge because there's just this like conversation happening. It's like, when is something going to explode? Or when is someone going to get shot, right? Like, why am I living in this? So there's a couple tricks we can use to keep the energy up. And the first one has to do with where you're putting attributions. And this is like on the minute level. So this first sentence here that I've marked up, Scott, Originally you wrote, Scott, she called from the kitchen table. Ursula was checking out the dining room table again. So if you listen to how I read it, like how I vocalize it uh, is an illustration of what my mind is doing when I said it. So I went, Scott, and then my mind's going to take a beat because there's a comma there. She called from the kitchen table. And then my mind's going to take another beat. Ursula was checking out the dining room table again. Right. So you can feel how putting the attribution in the middle of the phrase there made that into two full phrases and slowed it down. And
Yep.
what you're doing when we do that is we're just pulling a little bit of energy out of the thing. Whereas if we can change this to be like, Scott, Ursula was checking out the dining room table again. She called toward the kitchen. Right. Like, so taking that attribution, putting it at the end or putting it at the beginning. And I'll talk a second about when you want to have it at the beginning, but putting it at the end or dropping it at the beginning or leaving it off altogether if you can, when there's just two characters talking and it's very clear who they are, will keep the energy flowing, especially when we get a big back and forth. Right. And it'll feel artistic to us as writers. Like it feels like we're adding variety when we jam that attribution in the middle of the sentence. But what we're getting in variety, we're sacrificing in energy in the piece.
Yep.
There are places where this is appropriate. We're like putting it, and it's natural and it really works in your favor with energy. So you did it here. Again, so it says, like, I'm going to back up one sentence where it says, you should come too, she said to Scott. If I could get away from work, I would, said Scott. I'd love to go back there. Right. So we want to beat, if I was to take out the said Scott, is if I could get away from work, I would. I'd love to go back there.
Yep.
Right. You can see, like, when I read it, I had that natural beat in there anyway, because the second half of this is a reflection, right? Like he's thinking back on something. So the character's having a mental pause. So dropping that attribution in the middle here is actually working in your favor because it's better illustrating what's going on, right? But here again, a little bit farther down, are you kidding? Said Mike. You're the most exciting thing that's happened on Mount Desert Island since the fire of 47. Right? All that energy that's building in the "are you kidding?" I lose when I dip down into that. So dropping it at the end, "Are you kidding? You're the most exciting thing that's happened on the desert island since the fire of 47," said Mike. Right? Like you can feel the energy building in the piece, and it's just going to make everything feel like it's moving a little bit faster and make these mundane info drops. It's going to make them feel higher energy.
So I had a question about that because as a reader, I sometimes get stuck on that because I'll start a sentence and I'll think for whatever reason that that's Scott.
Yeah.
So I'll be reading to myself, are you kidding? That's the most exciting thing that's happened on Mount Desert Island since the fire of 47. And I'm thinking it's Scott and then said Mike. And I'm like, oh, it's Mike. And then I have to kind of go back and rethink the sentence now that I know who it really is.
Yeah, we don't want the reader having to rewind in their brain because that's frustrating, especially if they keep doing it. I think here you're in the clear because Mike and Scott's voices are so different. So like I can tell if it's Mike or Scott by how they sound.
Okay.
Because Scott's fairly laid back. He uses less words, right? Like Mike is using more words. Mike is more aggressive. I can't imagine Scott in this scene saying the words, "Are you kidding?"
Yes.
Right? Like, because Mike is just more aggressive. So like I can hear it. But in large cast scenes, like big cast scenes like this, where you've got more than two people talking, three or more people talking, I 100% agree. You've got to be super careful. Another way to do it is to drop it up front here and to add some motion to what's happening.
Yep.
So I call this the Law and Order effect, which is just 100%. I don't know if this is true. I don't know if this is a thing, but this is true for me because it's the first time I noticed it. Law and Order SVU, which has been going for like 70 years. It's been on the air forever. They do this thing where they have to have these scenes in the police station where like the three detectives are talking to each other. And it's if you think about it in reality, it's the weirdest thing. They'll be sitting in a triangle. They're always in a triangle. They're sitting in a triangle, and when one of them starts talking, he starts moving, and the other two sit still. And then when he stops talking, he'll like come to a resting position, and then the camera will flip to the other one, and then that one will start moving and talking at the same time. It's the weirdest thing, but what it does is it creates this energy. It's like they're passing a hot potato, right? So
Yeah.
one will be like, "Yeah, I totally think you did it." Come to a stop. And then the next one's like, "Well, I think blah 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 blah." Come to a stop. And the next one's like, "And I think blah 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 blah." And like, so it creates this like motion, and we can do that in our in these dialogue scenes as well, if we can take that movement and drop it at the front of the attribution at the front. So
Yep.
like here, you had it in the middle. Speak of the devil, Mike said, reading the text. Corey wants to meet Anne and me at 8. Now, dropping the attribution here in the middle isn't necessarily bad here because you've got two separate thoughts, right? Like, speak of the devil, Mike said, reading the text. Corey wants me to meet Anne at 8. So you're not really losing any energy there. It's going to, like, there would have been a natural beat there anyway. But because you've got this action, I'm going to pop it up at the front. Reading the text, Mike said, speak of the devil, Corey wants me to meet Anne at 8, and Anne and me at 8. Right. So,
Yep.
but adding that motion in there really does create that sense of like action, even when there is no action. And it's on this minute level. So the way that I tend to think about it is that, like, if you've got a bucket, right? Like an action is turning the faucet on all the way, right? Like, so we're like in a chase scene, like a car chasing. We got the faucet on all the way, and it's just water's just pouring out, right? This kind of action, we're just going to turn the water on a trickle. So we're not like having an action scene, but things are still moving, right? Like we haven't turned the
Yep.
spigot off all the way. So if we can just take this, will keep it moving a little bit, taking that attribution and putting it at the front. And like you're saying, in a big cast scene, this is helpful because it allows us to um, introduce who's speaking before. So I really like to do this whenever I'm introducing a character that hasn't spoken for a while. So for example, in your piece, Anne doesn't talk as much as Mike and Scott do,
Yep.
right? Like she interjects at good moments, but when she interjects, she hasn't necessarily said anything. And I think I might have stumbled on one. Well, we've got her here. So we've got Mike sat down, eat fast, he said to Anne. Scott shook his head. You made dinner. You'd think you'd want us to have time to enjoy it. What's Corey in a hurry about? Anne asked Mike. I imagine he wants to talk about a possible topic. Another topic, you mean? Scott said, helping himself to Brussels sprouts. It's Corey's fault that it's taking a long time. He can't come up with a reasonable topic, Mike said. Anne smiled. You really need to stop. So, like, putting Anne's up here at front because, we've got this, like, she's kind of trapped here in between Mike and Scott.
Yep.
And Mike and Scott are both big personalities, and
Mhm.
Anne doesn't have as big a personality in this piece. She may later in the book, but these two scenes, she's more an observer and commenter than she is driving the action.
Yep.
So getting that attribution for her up front in places like this is going to be good
Yeah.
because
I
it
like
lets
that.
the reader know, like, hey, she's interjecting between Mike and Scott.
Yep.
Okay, so not interrupting beats of your sentences to let the energy build by moving that attribution to the front of the back, right? And then adding motion to it, right? Scott looked at his watch, is a great motion. So, and it creates a false sense of action in the piece. And then bringing in when we're introducing characters, when a character is less active in the conversation, putting that attribution up front so we know that it's them coming in, because especially in this first scene, we'll just naturally assume it's Mike or Scott talking because they're so aggressive in their own ways, right? Like Scott's
Yep.
aggressively passive. So getting that like up there up front is
Yep.
good. With Anne, to let people know, like, oh, Anne's interjecting here. How do you feel about all of that?
That all makes sense. Yeah, I like that.
Okay. That was a lot. I just talked for a long time. Um, yeah, and I do like these big. I always feel weird writing these big cast scenes because I feel like I'm saying people's names a lot. But like we were talking with the audiobook, you got to say their name all the time, right? Like just to get their name in. And again, you get so much information out here. It's really impressive. I read the first 5 pages and I was like, man, she got so much in, and I haven't even breathed to stop reading yet. It was really good. And
Good.
I have ADD, so it's impressive. Um,
Thank you.
yeah. Have I know this isn't the first chapter. Have Mike and Scott appeared already in the book?
No.
Okay. Something I'd like to see worked in. Um, do you ever do Toastmasters?
No.
Okay. So something they teach at Toastmasters, or that they'll teach in, like, networking books, is introduce people. It's a big joke in the book Bridget Jones' Diary. Actually, it was the first place I encountered it. Is introduce people with interesting details, like one or two interesting details about them that, like, is one sentence. So there's a classic scene. I don't know if it's in the book. It's in the movie. There's a classic scene in the movie Bridget Jones' Diary where she's at, like, a party and she's introducing people, and the details she introduces them with are horrible. It's really funny, but we want to do that with our characters. So because I read the last Ann Kinnear pieces I read from you were like back in October. I don't remember who Scott and Mike are. And
Yeah.
I immediately assumed, just because this is mystery, suspense, thriller world, that they were a love interest. And about 2/3 of the way down, I discovered that Mike was her brother.
Yeah.
And then I felt weird. I was like, oh, I feel weird.
Yeah.
Because, yeah. So just dropping in here so she yells at Scott, and then it says Scott Pate appeared in the doorway, right? Scott Pate, comma, um, the nosy next door neighbor who, uh, is always around when dinner appeared in the doorway, right? Like, and that's all we need, just like something to kind of type them in our head. So you can be like, okay, this is who this is. Not even a full sentence, just like one or two interesting details about the character, right? Like Mike, Anne's brother and manager. I don't know what you would call him in her relationship, or like
Mhm.
Anne's brother and promoter, blah, 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 blah. Right. Like, so just giving us those, like, couple details when you introduce somebody um, helps us get the frame of reference. And
I think it's really interesting because in my acknowledgments, John, editor, if you're listening, here's a little surprise for you. My acknowledgement says, to my editor John, who reminds me that reader doesn't mean mind reader.
nice.
And and he was always saying, like, nobody knows that except you. Would you just tell the reader? But I also think it's interesting because if I try to think about this from the reader point of view, or I think of books that aren't my own that I'm reading, I'm willing to go with it if someone says, Fred came into the room and helped himself to a cookie. I'm kind of okay not knowing who Fred is at that moment, as long as, in the next page or two, I get some more
Yeah, you
information
get a
about
feel for
Fred.
them. Yeah.
And it avoids that kind of the bad alternative. Reminds me of, like, when you see actors who are reading through a script, and they're all sitting around the table for the first read through, or whatever that's called. And then there's someone who says, like, Jane came in and walked to the cookie jar.
Yeah.
And I want to avoid that sort of in your face,
Yeah.
rubbing it in a little bit.
Yeah. You don't want it to feel like they're reading a screenplay, which is like,
Right.
Billy enters stage left, drops book on table, puts on
Right.
glasses because Billy is smart, right? Like, you don't want to do that. And I think there is a happy medium. I would, I tend to quote books and then I get in trouble because people are like, that doesn't happen in that book. And I'm like, oh, I was thinking of a different one. So don't quote me on this. but don't hold me to this. I hold the right to be completely wrong. In my head, it's been like 7 years since I read a Harry Potter book, but in my head, I remember her doing this, J.K. Rowling doing this really well in the second, third, and fourth book, in that when a character appeared, she had like a 2 sentence introduction that summed up that character and what their relationship was to Harry in
Mhm.
like a flash. It was like, oh yeah, I got that. Right. Like, and
Yeah.
there's a happy medium in there between the like, you know, clunky screenplay-esque, weird, makes the reader feel like what's happening here, where did the art in this go, and the like, you know making the reader figure it out too much. My first book, my first work of fiction, was called Mankin and the Monsters, and it follows a reporter named Mencken Cassie. And Mangan is in Baltimore City, and he's this freelance reporter who's trying to make a name for himself, and he is African American, and it's important because racial tensions play into the book. Uh, I did not specifically say he was African American. I never put it in there. I didn't describe his physical appearance, besides the fact that he was really tall, until like chapter 27. And then I like drop. I don't even remember why I did it, but there was a natural place where like somebody commented on him being African American. And my first beta readers, I had 3 of them get really mad at me. And they left these, like, I had given them, I didn't know how to do like digital stuff or anything. So I had to literally like printed off these like Word documents and delivered it to these beta readers in like manila envelopes. And be like, here you go. Because that's what they do in the movies. So it's like, oh, this is how beta readers work. So
Sounds very
and
romantic,
I know.
very artistic.
Really a huge pain in the butt, and it cost me a lot of money at Kinko's, that I was like, why didn't I just email this to you? So, and I'd like to be like, oh, it was 20 years ago and you didn't have email, but no, I've only been writing for 6 years, so it wasn't that long ago. So, so anyway, in red ink all over the page, I pictured him as a 20-something gangly white kid on a
Yeah,
bicycle, because I
that
kept
is
using the word
tough.
bike, and I was, in my head, bike was this motorcycle that he
Yep.
was riding around. But they had in their head, they were imagining themselves in the role, and so in their head they had this like, you know gangly white kid on a bicycle, because they rode bicycles, right? Like, and
Yeah, I think that
so
if you don't describe the person right away, you just have to not describe them and leave it up to the reader's
yeah,
judgment,
100%.
because there are times when much less significant than the race of the person. I've, been reading along, and on page 400 it turns out that they have red hair, and I'm like, they do not have red
They do not
hair.
have red hair. Yeah. And so, I think it's hard as authors to find that weird middle where we introduce somebody and we're like, okay, what does the reader need to know so that the reader and I are on the same page? Right. Like,
Yep.
so the author and the reader are on the same page. And how do we
Yep.
get there? Like, it's such a tough thing to do. Um, yeah. Anyway. Uh, okay. Let's talk about, okay. We've talked about energy. We've talked about 1 sentence intros. Let's talk about exaggerating big personalities. So, like I was saying, Scott, to me, appears to be laid back. Am I getting that right? Is that his?
Well, he's very enthusiastic. I would say that I generally avoid using exclamation points at all in my books, but if there's an exclamation point in a book, it means that Scott is saying something.
Okay. How
Um,
would you describe his personality?
Very friendly, very enthusiastic, very supportive, um,
Okay.
very like gracious, like trying to get other people to talk about themselves more, and then being very interested in everything they have to say.
Gotcha. Okay. And that's what I was reading. Um, I was going to highlight things and I decided not to. If you're watching this on YouTube, that's how I was reading. Was this like kind of life of the party kind of guy, but not the man of action that Mike is. Is that true?
Not as aggressive as Mike is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Scott feels very realistic, and Mike feels very realistic. and Anne feels very realistic. So in this opening scene, you have three very realistic characters, and that's actually hurting you because the conversation feels like a normal conversation people would have at dinner, but nobody wants to read those. So like I would say take Scott is your fun character. And I would say take your fun character and blow him out. Like make Scott more, make him bigger, make him you know, a little bit louder and a little bit aggressively not wanting to leave dinner, right? Add some more interplay between he and Mike. More teasing from Scott, from Mike, more poking at Mike.
Yep.
Because so like here's a good moment where like I wanted a little bit more, right? So they're talking about this guy they're about to meet. And Mike says he's like an MDI encyclopedia. And Scott says he's like a world encyclopedia. And Mike says it's not fair. And Anne's like, it's not a competition. And then Scott says, your brother thinks everything's a competition, right? Like this is a nice place where Scott is like whispering it loud enough so that Mike can hear, but saying it to Anne, which sets Scott out, right? Like as somebody who is going to play around. But this joke that he's put in, world encyclopedia and competition, I want it to come back, right? Like find a way to bring that back a couple times to like ramp up the humor and to set Scott apart as like the Statler and Wardolph in the balcony of the Muppet Show that are like not necessarily helping the scene, but commenting on the scene.
Yeah, yeah.
And what a big personality does like that is it does two things for you. One, it keeps the reader entertained, especially in a mundane thing. And then two, it distinguishes the other personalities. So if you've got three realistic personalities, even though they sound different and I can pick out their differences, they kind of start to meld together because they're just realistic. They're all at the same level.
Yep.
Right. But if we take Scott up here and we keep Anne and Mike here, now all of a sudden the reader feels this variety because you've got one of them at a different level. You do that in the second half of the piece. Right? In the second half of the piece, you have this fantastic character, Garrick, who like I laughed out loud. They're on a Zoom call and you've got a scene where somebody asks Garrick to turn on his light because they can't see him because he's sitting in the darkness. And he flicks it on and they're all like, thank you, that's great. And then he turns it off again because they've seen him. So he's like, I could be done with this.
Yep.
And he's such a big, like everyone else's levels are here. You got Corey and Mike, and then Kyle's a little bit higher because he's got that kind of like quasi inappropriate, like, you know, filmmaker, but Garrett's up here. And because Garrett's up here, I forget that I'm reading a Zoom call. Right. Like I forget that they're like just having a conversation because everything Garrick says like changes the tone a little bit. So it feels, you feel this huge variety because you've taken one of the characters and just like leveled them up in energy.
Yeah.
Even though, and when I say in energy, Garrick is not a high energy character, right? Like he's actually the opposite. In my head, he was the food critic from Ratatouille. That's kind of how he looked at in my mind. So, but when I say energy, I mean like what he's bringing to the moment. He's like bringing the peace in his like, you know, words, in his properness and his like eruditeness. That's the word I was looking for. He adds energy to the piece because he distinguishes himself from the other voices. So the big cast ensemble feels very different, even though Corey and Mike's voices are very similar. Right. And Kyle's just a little bit different. Kyle has some spark moments, but he's not like, you know, way off of Corey and Mike. They're having a professional conversation about a documentary. And until Kyle like really starts to pop with commenting on how somebody looks, they all kind of feel close to the same. But you put Garrick in there, who's got this like more outlandish personality, and all of a sudden the piece has a ton of energy, right? So
Yeah.
the first half, I wanted that from Scott.
Yeah.
I kept hoping Scott was going to give me more.
Yeah.
Like, give me more so that Ann and Mike can be Ann and Mike, and you can be like a little bit bigger, and the piece feels more fun and energetic. Does that make sense?
It does. And I also wonder if um, maybe it's too late for the scene, but for future scenes, especially at the beginning, I can imagine that I might not have it around the dinner table. I might have like Anne, Mike, and Scott are out getting ice cream, and then Mike gets the text, and they all have to like get to the car, and one of
Yeah.
them drops their ice cream, and then the other one is like annoyed and wants to go back for more ice cream, and then the other one says they can't because they don't have time. Like
Yeah.
having it be a more just naturally active scene, I think would help that.
Yeah. Like something I wanted in this scene was I really wanted Mike to start trying to take Scott's plate. Like
Yeah.
because Mike's like trying to rush things along, and I really wanted the comic, nature of Scott like eating and protecting his plate at the same time. Like
Yeah.
that felt funny to me. So are they eating at the beginning of every book?
No.
Oh, I love it when writers do that. So having these setup scenes that like repeat at the beginning of every book, because it's
Yeah.
some readers are going to grab our first book and then they're going to read all the way, they're going to pound all the way through the series, and then they're going to like be done with it. And thank you, I love those readers, they're amazing. Some readers are going to read our first book, and I'm one of these. We're going to read our first book and they're going to read like 5 other things, and they're going to come back to our second book and they're like, wait, okay, where was I? And then they're going to go read like 4 other things, and they're going to come back to our third book and they're like,
Yep.
okay, hold on. So Laura Lipman does this really well with her Tess McGonigal series, which is her like Baltimore reporter detective character. Baltimore Blues, I think, is the first one, and I love this series so much. She's so fantastic. Um, so she will kind of start the books off in the same kind of way, right? And it creates this, so like you were saying, like them going to ice cream, them eating dinner at the table, them like, it's not the exact same thing, but it's similar enough that what it does is it kind of sets the tone of the series. You're like, oh, that's who these people are.
Yeah.
Like that's where they are, or again, going back to Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling did this. Harry Potter's, the first several start with him back home
The Dursleys.
at the Dursleys.
Yeah.
And you get like 2 to 3 chapters at the Dursleys.
Yeah.
Now, with each book, Harry is different.
Yeah.
So and the tone of the book is different,
Yep.
right? Like I think it's by book 3 or book 4. It must be I don't remember, where like Harry's actually being chased. It's book 3. Where Harry's being chased by the Dementors, right? Like, and so the tone of the opening is very different because it's like wartime Harry. So you like, but it has that, you get into it and you're like, that's right. This is who this is. He lives at Privet Drive. He's the boy under the stairs, even though he's only under the stairs in one book, right? Like, but you put him back with the Dursleys and you're like, okay, there's a familiar tone here, and I can feel it and I get it. And like, I'm gathering again what this is, so yeah, I love series that do that, because I find it really helpful to like engage in that series in that way. And it resets those characters in my head. If you're like me and you're a jerk, it reminds me of the Mission Impossible movies. Or TV show before, but the movie specifically, Tom Cruise is always doing something fun in the start of the movie. He's at a dinner party with his like fiance. He's climbing a mountain, like he's always doing something fun. And then he gets the call.
Yeah.
And the call is like, here's your mission.
Yep.
If you choose to accept it, this thing will self-destruct. And the minute you get that, you're like, yep, I'm in. This is what I came for. I came for this thing.
Yep.
Anyway. Yeah, just using that kind of repeated scene in a series to like reset what's happening with the book. Okay. Last thing I wanted to talk about. Matty, you got to stop me because I'll just ramble on for days. Yeah. This is the first scene ends. I've spent a lot of time in the first scene, which is funny because the reason I have is because your second scene, there are pages where I had no notes. And that's
Cool.
that's super, like page 6, no notes. It's fantastic. You've got, and okay, let's talk about some things I really liked. Page 6, you're entering into a Zoom call and you've got 3 characters that are entering the scene that you have to introduce. You do a fantastic job in a paragraph. You give each one a paragraph. You hit it and you're out, right? Like no long descriptions of how Mike and Ann have engaged with these people. No like unnecessary talking about like the background behind them. Like 3 paragraphs and you're right back into the dialogue. And that made me so happy.
I also see that I am doing there what I failed to do with Scott and Mike and even Anne, that I have the little bit like Corey has bedhead and
Yeah.
Kyle has a pompadour and things like that.
Yeah, and you're giving me just a little like, again, I don't think for Scott, Mike, and Ann at the beginning I would do a full paragraph. I would just do like 2 or 3. I mean, maybe just 2 quick things about them, like Mike, Ann's brother, who blah blah blah.
Yep.
Right. Scott, the who holds romantic feelings for Anne and only appears at dinner. Right. Like those, like just that. But this is different because, and I think part of it is Scott, Mike, and Ann are recurring characters. I'm assuming these people don't come back in other books.
Garrick does.
Garrett. Oh, really? That's fun. He's fun. He's a good character.
I love Garrick.
Yeah, he's a good character. You did a good job with him. So, if they're not recurring characters, they need, especially in a mystery, because when I read a mystery, every character you introduce, every character you give a name to, I'm like suspect, because I'm constantly, when I read a mystery, and I love reading mysteries, when I read a mystery, I'm trying to solve it, right? Like it's a puzzle and I want to win. I want to win the book. And so every character, I'm like making a mental note. I'm like, all right, Corey Duff might have killed somebody, right? Like it's just that like making, so this kind of paragraph introduction, and especially in mysteries, I think is super important because we need to know, we need to set out who all the suspects are early in the book.
Yep.
For those obnoxious readers like me who are playing a game with it. Worst thing you can do to me as a mystery reader is introduce the killer like 2/3 of the way through. That's the worst. Give them to me early.
Yeah.
Even if you got to force them in, I want to be able to guess who it is. And if you don't bring them in until 2/3 of the way through, I feel so cheated. I'm like, you cheated, author. You cheated. Anyway, I couldn't guess them because they didn't show up until page 120.
Yeah.
Agatha Christie's the worst at that. Anyway, sorry. There's just, I can complain about her work because she's not with us anymore. But yeah, I'll stop rambling. So you do that great here. I also love what you're doing here in the back and forth. Is really, really good. Again, I'm taking some of your like middle pieces, like here you originally wrote, of course I've seen the video from Layman's Point, said Kyle, extraordinary stuff, over 1 million views last time I checked. That video is why we need Ann, Garrick, and Mount Desert all to be part of this package. There's a like building of energy in this phrase, right? Of course I've seen the video from Lyman's Point, extraordinary stuff, right? Like there's no break there.
Yep.
But we created when we dropped, said Kyle.
Yep.
So creating action, right? Like jumping in, false sense of action. Kyle said, of course I've seen the video from Layman's Point, extraordinary stuff, right? Like so that we can keep that like flow of energy. But anyway, I loved this whole piece. That's why I'm talking so much about the first scene, because the second scene was so strong. I no notes.
Excellent.
So into the first piece, let's talk about the cadence.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple things we have to pay attention to when we're ending a scene. right? Like even when that scene comes in the middle of a chapter. And I'm going to define a scene. When I think of a scene in a book, I'm thinking of a theater scene, right? Like where someone is leaving the stage and someone is coming on the stage, or the setting's changing. Um, we have some kind of shift that, so a scene in the theater is like we're locked into a single conversation, and then that conversation comes to an end, and just like a song, there's like a cadence to it that lets the reader know this part is ending and something else is beginning, right? So you have
Yep.
a scene here where they're going to transition to Mike's office, and they leave Scott behind, which is how we know it's ending, even though he calls from downstairs, which is great. So they leave Scott behind, and they introduce new characters, right? So we get that like close and open to the new scene. Um, and you did a good job here. So if we're wrapping things up and moving to the new scene, we need to transition the content. That's the first thing we need to transition, right? The content of this conversation about, that's kind of setting up where they are and who they are and who the people they're about to talk to. That content's going to change to focus on the documentary that they're going to make. Right. So
Yep.
at first they're talking about the people in scene one, scene two, they're talking about the documentary. So you're wrapping the content really well. Um, Changing the scene or changing the characters is another thing we have to be aware of. You're doing that well too. Like I knew without a doubt that they were leaving one room and going into another room. No question, right? Scene is changing. You describe the new room really well, right? Like this is Mike's office. There's stuff on the walls. Anne doesn't like what's on the walls. Like it's great. Um, Emotional end to the scene, because there's also emotional content we have to wrap. Even in this one, which is a very slight change in emotional tone, we do want, and that's where I wanted more here, is that emotional end to the scene. So we were talking when we started the call about which of those three things keeps the reader reading. It's the content, right? We want to stop. You'll hear a lot of times people say, like, stop your chapter mid content to make the reader want more. And you kind of have a choice. It's either mid content or mid emotional tone. But usually the content and the emotional tone are linked. So you like, you know, if you have a scene where three people are fighting, and at the end of the fight, one of the characters is going to die, right? Stop your chapter right before that character dies, because the reader's going to be like, what happened? And then they're going to go to the next chapter. And that's what we want, right? Like we
Yep.
want them to move. But I'm going to wrap the moment so that there feels some resolution. I may wrap this emotional tone, and in the next moment, I'm going to escalate to a higher emotional tone. So at the end of the scene, I'm going to wrap an emotional tone a little bit, and then but I'm not going to wrap the content so that the reader keeps going. Right here, you're not wrapping the content. We're talking about what's going to happen next. So the reader's going to keep going because they want to see this phone call you're about to have. Right.
Yep.
But there's an emotional shift here in that they go from hanging out at dinner and having more Scott type emotional level run the scene to going to a Zoom call where Mike emotional level is going to run the scene.
Yep.
So I want to wrap to that Scott emotional level, which means we need to have a little bit of fun and games here at the end, right? We need to escalate Mike's emotional tone because that's who we're transitioning to. So let's give Mike a little bit more domination of the scene, rushing people along. Move, move, move. And let's let Anne be our vehicle that carries the tone for the reader, right? Like, so because Mike has been trying to rush Scott and has now given up on Scott and is now just going without Scott and calling Anne to follow him. So let's let Anne have that like hurried feeling to transition from one tone to the next tone. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just thinking, and it'll give a little bit of a cadence and prep the reader for the next scene, right? So just adding a couple lines in here that builds to that, like Anne gulped down another piece of chicken, passed a minuscule morsel to Ursula, tossed her plate in the sink, and called by Scott as she chased after her brother.
Yeah.
Right? Just adding that kind of like quick line and then giving Scott the callback. Have fun with the human encyclopedia, Scott called so that as he finished his chicken.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so and I might change that finished. I don't like the word finished there now. I might be like, as he like ruminated over his chicken or something that like
Yeah.
indicates that like now he can be laid back again, that Mike has left the room.
Yeah.
So, but giving us that emotional wrap to Scott so that we can move into the new content where we're not going to have the like, party guy energy of Scott, and we're going to get into this new scene.
Right.
I think when I write scenes, 9 times out of 10, it's actually probably more like 19 times out of 20. I end the scene too early without giving an appropriate emotional transition to the reader. Or because I'm so focused on like ending the content before we get there, or without giving the reader the like actual scene change. And I get in trouble with that because in the next scene, I have to start the next scene with the scene change. And that's no fun, right? Like we want to start the next scene with the action.
Yeah.
So all that to say, like, I'm guilty of this. I think we all do it because I know as I'm writing, the reason I do that 19 times out of 20 is because when I'm writing, I start thinking and visualizing the next scene. So I just wrap this one and I'm already in my head moving to the next one. And I always have to come back and be like, oh, I need to stretch this a little bit more so the reader can say goodbye to the Scott and say goodbye. What they're really saying goodbye to is the emotional tone that
Yeah.
Scott brought to the scene, and prepare the reader emotionally to get ready for the next tone that they're going to get.
Well, yeah, I really like that because there's, in a way, sort of the same, a little bit jabby at each other in both scenes, but in the Anne Mike Scott scene, it's all friendly.
Yeah.
And then in the Zoom call scene, it's not all friendly.
It's not all friendly. It's all business. And Anne disappears.
Yeah.
Right? Like the only time she's included in the Zoom call is when Mike turns and whispers something to her, and then Mike goes back. So Anne at best is kind of a passive player
Mhm.
in that Zoom call. And the reason that's important is because Anne and Scott are closer in like, this is where I'm going to get woo woo. If we had each of them as a color of energy, right? Like, yeah. Sorry, I'm laughing at myself. If we have each of them as a
No, I
color
like
of it,
this.
I'm just gonna keep going. I'm gonna
Do.
charge into it because it works in my head. We have each of them as a color of energy, right? And Mike's like the radiating off of Mike is a red aura, right? Like he is business. He's ready to go. He's fired up. So we're gonna give him a red aura, and then radiating off of Scott is a blue aura, right? Party guy, chill, let's hang, have a good time, blue aura. Anne is a green aura, embracing, accepting. She's closer to Scott than she is to Mike. So it makes sense when you get into the more red colored scene that Anne is going to step back and Mike is going to step forward because Mike's energy dominates that scene.
Yeah, I really like that.
I warned you that I was going to get woo-woo. So I feel so weird. People are going to be like, Jeff is crazy.
Well, you're
So,
channeling the first Anne Kinnear book, because in the first Anne Kinnear book, Anne's spirit sensing ability, that's her shtick. The
yeah,
spirit sensing ability isn't as progressed as it is in later books. And what she does is she senses spirits often through the color she
nice.
perceives from them. So I think you're just, you're just
Yeah.
bringing that forward.
Awesome. It was intentional, Matty. It was intentional.
You thought about that for hours.
Oh man, I've been working on this illustration for years. I was working on it before the Ann Kinnear book. No, this is how I think of a lot of times when I think of my characters, I think of them as colors because the color it matches an emotional energy, right? Like we see certain colors and they make us feel certain things, right? Like restaurants are typically painted in orange, yellows, and reds because that makes us hungry, right? If we're looking at a website, when people want to buy something, when we want somebody to buy something, we color it red because for some reason, the color red makes you want to grab it, right? Like, so
Yeah.
like we color it red, we color the link button red because it makes people want to click it. Colors have these weird impacts on us. And so I try to think of my characters' energies as colors, because it's like, oh, this is my blue color. So this guy's going to like bring the chill comfort time. Right. This
Yeah.
is my green color because this is like the learner. She's going to bring the learning, the like the reflection. You know, sometimes I'll think of green as like stability. Red is always action to me. People of action have red colors in my head. So anyway, all that to say, as we're thinking of transitioning, for me, it helps to think of like, okay, what color am I leaving and what color am I going to? And how do I bring a nice wrap to the color I'm leaving so that the scene color that I'm going to doesn't feel herky jerky, unless I want it to feel herky jerky.
Yeah.
And then, like, especially if, you know, if you're writing to save the cat type stuff, um, the villain's rally beat that leads into the um see, I'm probably messing this up. Save the cat people are gonna be like, no, that's not the beat. Um, but the bad guys rally that usually leads into the dark night of the soul or the all is lost moment. A lot of times the bad guys rally feels very herky jerky because it's a surprise. It's like, oh, whoa, hey, I didn't see that coming. And that's in that, you know, you want to do the reverse of what we're talking about, which is flip the color hard and like make flip the characters hard, and then let the characters talk about how surprised they are. Just like here, I'm asking you to like, hey, let Anne join Scott and let Anne be the vehicle of transition from one scene's tone to the next. Same thing in like, you know, have whatever character represented your heroes winning, let them comment on, are we about to lose? And like, you know, let them almost say what the reader's thinking so that you get that, like, you can feel the emotional weight of it, the emotional
Okay.
impact of it. Anyway, having creatively having the characters comment on what you want the reader to feel uh has a, if when done artfully, like if it's obvious, readers are like, come on. But if it's done artfully, it can really engage the reader in a deep way, because the reader's like, yeah, we're in this together. I was feeling the same way. Like, have you ever been in a conversation with somebody and they say something, you're like, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
If we can do it artfully, like Anne here, you know, getting her to gulp down something and like say a goodbye to Scott, what we're artfully doing is like having the reader say goodbye to Scott through Anne's eyes, right? So we can move into the next scene.
So if I had something like, let's say, Mike is rushing Anne through finishing her dinner, like you suggested,
Mm.
and then they go to the phone call, the Zoom call, and maybe there's a long, awkward pause where Anne is thinking, maybe Anne has a cup of coffee and she takes a drink because there's nothing else to do during that long, awkward pause, and it creates a contrast to the friendly but rushed scenario of the first scene to the sort of painfully
Yeah,
stretched out
stretched out
tone of the
Zoom call.
second
Yeah,
scene.
you could totally do that. Another way to do it would be to have Anne bring the friendly energy into the Zoom call and then have Mike shut her down. So have Anne be like, hey, Garrick, like over Mike's shoulder, and Mike like put on mute and be like, hey, this is a work call. Right. Like, and again, like having Mike say what you want the reader to know.
Yeah,
Like,
I
this
see
is a
what you're
work call.
saying. Yeah.
Right. Like, so that the reader's like, the other way would work too, though, is having Anne feel awkward in the tone transition. That's just that's like the other flip side of the coin, is having Anne feel like you're saying, like sip her coffee and kind of like try to figure out where she's gonna sit and realize there's nowhere for her to sit. So she like you almost want her to like sit down on the floor. I guess I'll sit over here. And then have Mike turn around and be like, hey, can you be professional? Please get up off the floor. Right. Like that, but that kind of like having her illustrate the transition you want the reader
Right.
to feel.
Right. Yeah.
And again, here, Matty, to be clear, I said that I'm going to be super nitpicky and nuanced because we're talking about like high level stuff in this one. Here, it's very low stakes, right? Like this is not a pivotal emotional moment in the book, right? It's super low stakes.
Right.
Um, where cadences, the absence of a cadence really hurts you is like if somebody dies and you don't let the reader sit with that for a minute, right? The
Yep.
reader gets mad. You know what book hacked me off? The Red Wedding in is it Crowns? I don't remember which the Saga of Ice and Fire or the Game of Thrones book it's in. But there's a scene where he kills a ton of people. And I loved some of the characters that died. And he just like hit it with like a sentence and then kept moving. And I was like, I no, I want to I need to stay with that for a minute. Like I'm
Yeah.
losing something here
Yeah.
and you're just blowing through it. Like, come on, man. I actually put the book down and like walked away from it for like a month because like I don't want to read that.
Yeah.
Um, it made me mad because I felt the loss of those characters, which speaks to like, hey, you engaged me, like you gave me these characters, but we need to be aware of our readers' emotional connection to what's happening, and if we're gonna, that's where the absence of a cadence, like I would say that moment missed a cadence. That's
Yeah.
where the absence of this like wrap up, this emotional cadence, really hurt me as a reader. So I like walked away. And
Yeah.
like we just need to respect like our readers' emotional engagement. If you don't have a cadence in this scene because it's low stakes, it's early in the book, right? Like we're really just like nobody's crying here, nobody's, super enthused. We're moving from one conversation to another. You're not going to lose any readers if this cadence is off. And I'm saying this more for Matty, not for you, but I'm saying this for people listening. But where we will lose readers is when we're having big emotional moments and we don't sit with them. In a romance, when the hero or heroine is realizes like has the first struggle with the love interest, and we don't give a cadence to the like moment that the relationship in essence dies. We don't let the reader just sit with it for a couple lines and we just move on to the next chapter. uh, that can damage the reader's emotional relationship with the book, right? Like, so just being
Yeah.
aware of the emotional energy that's happening, that our readers having, the emotional engagement our readers having with each scene, and like really thinking through that as much as we think through the plot, because we'll obsess over the plot, right? Like we'll talk about like what's the inciting incident in this scene, how's the inciting incident paying off, like what's the challenge happening, what are the choices the reader's making in the characters are making in the scene. Like we'll obsess over the plot and completely ignore the emotional energy of the scene.
Yeah.
And like, but if we want to take our work to the next level, we have to be also as aware of the emotional energy of the scene and what's happening with the characters, and really what the emotional journey of the readers are. um, if you want to see somebody talk about emotional journey really great, Kurt Vonnegut wrote a master's thesis on story structure. Vonnegut doesn't say this. This is my interpretation of the video. You can find it on YouTube. Go to YouTube and type in Kurt Vonnegut story, and you see him in front of a chalkboard drawing these big curves on a graph and talking about what the story's doing. What the way I interpret what he's talking about is this is the emotional energy of the story. It's low, it's high, it's low, it's high, right? Or he talks about man in a pit. Starts
Hmm.
high, goes low, comes back high again, right?
Yep.
All is lost. Starts high, goes low. And he references like this is a tragedy, right? Like we feel terrible at the end.
Yep.
And he's talking about the emotional energy of the piece, of the whole book, and of each scene. And so understanding our readers' emotional journey through these scenes and how the emotional energy is changing from one scene to another, and making sure that we're strategic about that it's a smooth transition when we just want the reader to like go along for the journey, and that it gets like herky jerky or it's abrupt when we want the reader to feel it and to really hurt it, and to make sure the reader gets time to sit with loss or time to sit with major changes. I think is really important. So yeah, and this is this moment in your scene, I was like, I'd like, and it doesn't take much, right? Like I'd like 2 more lines for Scott,
Yep.
so I can say goodbye to Scott. Yeah. Anyway,
Yep.
all right, anything else you wanted to talk about?
I don't believe so. That is
Okay.
great.
Yeah,
I
Maddie, thanks for letting me see this and play with it and talk about it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for doing it. This is
Yeah,
especially the whole color thing. I like that a lot.
awesome. I'm glad.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I
Good
keep
to
waiting
have
for somebody to call me out and be like, "That's that shit crazy." Waiting at some point
This is going to become your thing. You'll be known as
as the
the
color
color
guy.
dialogue guy.
Yeah, I'm already known as the Daisy guy, the dialogue Daisy guy, and now I could be the color guy. Um, yeah, and people who hang out with me so we have a Dialogue Doctor Slack that you can get in if you go to Patreon and subscribe to the Patreon. And it came out of the master class that I taught for 21 weeks. And people joke in the Slack and in the master class because when I get really deep into like emotional flow of a scene, I whip out this chart and I actually like make you chart it. Like we didn't need to do that for this piece, but I'll be like, we're gonna chart your emotional flow just like your chart, just like we chart your plot, and we're gonna make it happen. And they tease me. They're like, oh, Jeff's gonna make me chart it. Um, so yeah, it's I get a little obsessed over emotional flow of scenes, but I think it makes our work more engaging. So I think it's
Yes.
yeah.
I think you're right.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording, Maddie, and we can keep talking. But thank you so much for this.
Thank
And
you, Jeff. Thank you.
everybody should go, if you like mysteries and suspense, you should go get the Engineer novels that you've written because they're great. Yeah.